Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to another Tournament Tactician. As we head into week 3 of the patch 3.0 meta, I'm not expecting as much movement from week 2 to week 3 as there was from week 1 to week 2. Week 1 to week 2, we sort of saw the fall of spiders and the rise of scouts. We saw players adapt to how they want to be countering both Ari Kennen and the control decks that we're seeing, and as such, scouts and other Demacia-based strategies started to pop up a little more, like Elusive Rally made a little bit of a comeback, and players have sort of figured out what slow punishers they like and which ones they don't. For example, Iceborne Poros. A lot of players were like, hey, you know, this gate keeps all the slow decks, so maybe it's still tournament viable, but it actually looks like players have gone back to Azir Aurelia for things that punish slower decks in the format. But I wasn't impressed enough by Azir Aurelia's performance in order to put it on the tier list. Similarly, I know that there are like Nami decks that are running around, but again, none that I really felt comfortable putting on the tier list. And this week is going to be pretty light and breezy because week 4 is when we start to get the big events. That will be the Mastering Runeterra Championship that all of these qualifiers have been leading up to. And then the week after that will be the seasonal tournament. So the tournament tacticians will get more in-depth from here on out. But this one is more or less, I'm expecting to see a lot more of what we saw in week 2. So at the top, we have Ari Kennen. Obviously still the best deck in the game. Players are trying to counter it and having success with that. And despite that, Ari Kennen is still having a lot of success in a lot of different variations. Go Hard Ari Kennen still the predominant one that players are going for as they try to leave open the Ari Kennen mirror and go ahead and play that out. Whereas the Absolver and Relentless Pursuit and mono versions really looking to not ban are looking to ban Ari Kennen rather and play against all these other decks and hedge their bets a little bit more in that regard. Darkness still the best control deck. Faded. Shyvana Pantheon is overwhelmingly the build for this. You'll still see Mono and Taric pop up in the top cuts, but if you are looking for one specific version of Pantheon to hone in on and try to counter, it would be Shyvana Pantheon. It is overwhelmingly the most popular, but Pantheon in general is not popular enough for you to try and counter this strategy, although it did pick up both tournament wins last week in the Mastering Runeterra Qualifier number 5, as well as the Online League Series. Speaking of the Online League Series, Lee Sin's back, baby. Now, Lee Sin, I have said multiple times that I wanted to permanently cement Lee Sin in Tier 1 as something that will continue to exist in Tier 1 as long as it is in its current state, as long as Eye of the Dragon and Lee Sin and Zoe all exist as they do. And I have been swayed. I have strayed from the path more often than I would like to admit because I will see Lee Sin perform very poorly, not top tournaments for like 3 weeks, and I'm like, ah, crap. I don't want to put this in Tier 1 and have people be like, oh, let me just build a Tier 1 lineup and copy-paste Lee Sin into their lineup and then get bodied because it is a very hostile environment for Lee Sin. But he comes back so randomly that, like, I every time I take him out of Tier 1, I know that I'm going to have to put him back later. As we approach the seasonal, I know he's got to go back up there. And I am just going to leave him there. And I keep telling myself that, and I keep changing my mind. But this time, I'm sure I am leaving Lee Sin there as long as it exists in its current state. And Anivia, of course, moving down to Tier 3 from Tier 1 because with aggro shifting from burn-oriented to board-oriented, trading out spiders for scouts, Anivia is still beating the other control decks, but it is not doing as well against aggro as you need a control deck to, and as such, sort of has fallen down to one of the worst control decks of the format, with Feel the Rush being better both in terms of win rate as well as speed of play, because something like Darkness can play a very tempo-oriented game plan and do well against these board-based decks because Twisted Catalyzer has a lot of attack, Dark Bulb Acolyte has some good trading power, can even curve out into something like a Stilted Robemaker and contest the board pretty well. Anivia doesn't get to do something like that. Even Feel the Rush gets to do it to an extent where if you can get off like a solid board wipe and then get down a Trundle on 5, that can be a very good stabilization tool. Anivia just starts playing the game a little bit too late and is too linear in its game plan, so when things are coming to counter control, they are going to do very well against Anivia, and as such, it has fallen down a little bit. So, getting into Tier 2, you know, Bandletree, FTR, Viego, Sivir Demacia, these are still seeing fringe playability. Their win rates are fine into the meta. They are on the upper echelon. They get to beat the rogue decks a little bit better, a little bit more consistently. They're, Spooky Viego, Sivir Demacia, Bandletree, relatively hard to play decks, but very rewarding if you are masterful of them. And then Sentinel Control has been moving up as players continue to look to beat up on the slower decks. Sentinel Control is doing very good at beating the things that are looking to beat control. It's doing very well against aggro. It is still losing to nearly every control deck, but that is kind of what we expected of it. And overall, with the meta still in flux, I think that Sentinel Control is in a good spot. I don't imagine it will stay Tier 2. I think this deck either has to settle in Tier 1 because of the way that the meta shakes out, or it has to settle in Tier 3 because there's too much control, and it just kind of remains to be seen. Scouts have moved up to Tier 2 because they actually didn't do as good / better than spiders did in week 1. In week 1, Spiders was one of the most popular decks, but aggro failed to take the final spot of any of the tournaments that we were looking at. Scouts, again, failed to take the final spots of any of the tournaments that we were looking at, but Scouts is doing better into players that are a little bit behind the curve in terms of what control should be looking like right now, and I think that the Scouts lineups are going to continue to evolve. Elusive Rally was a little bit of something that players were experimenting with last weekend. Definitely think that Scouts is above Elusive Rally. Really curious to see what these finalized aggro lineups look like going into week 3, because with Control and Ari Kennen still doing very well, it's really aggro that's kind of on the back foot and is still playing catch-up in terms of what their lineups are going to look like, trying to, you know, figure out what they need to do to win a tournament and beat out the meta and all these other things. So Scout's sitting in tier 2. Is it the best aggro deck? Probably. Does that make it a tier 1 deck? Not necessarily. It's probably either going to get banned, so we're not going to get to like see its performance and be like, yeah, Scouts is a really good deck, because even if a deck has a 100% ban rate, I don't know that I could put it at tier 1 because I've never actually seen the deck perform. The stats on it are going to be dog shit, and that's where you kind of have to take this objectivity and subjectivity and mesh them together. But I am a hater. I don't like Scouts. I don't think they're as good as a lot of people are putting them out to be, so I am keeping them in tier 2, but a lot of players who would make a similar tier list would put them in tier 1. And then in tier 3, you know, just kind of rounding things out, we have the decks that are like playable that we're seeing in fringe playability, maybe 1 or 2 of them showing up in the top 8 of an event. Iceborne Spiders, you know, still kind of figuring out their builds. First, we saw the Cephalopod Howling Abyss version, then Broken Ball came out with like a Catalog of Regrets version, and then the version that we saw in week 2 was more, it was basically TLC. It was like Trundle, Ladros Control, old school like TLC with Spiders, and that just kind of means that you are trading out Avalanche and Bladed Ravine for the Spider package, which honestly I don't mind. Bladed Ravine and Avalanche are not phenomenal into Scouts, Avalanche especially, since it can still get Rangers resolved. Bladed Ravine is still fine, but we're seeing those cards cut from Iceborne Spiders for the most part. I could see like a TLC version that is still running Bladed Ravine, I think would be pretty good. I don't really have an opinion on Catalog of Regrets. Probably a little bit too much board space taken up, but I do think that Iceborne Spiders is something that is still being figured out and can find a good place in the meta. Is it better than Feel the Rush? I don't know. Should it go in your control lineup? I don't know. It's very much still in flux, and I'm just kind of waiting on the sidelines, but keeping an eye on it, so I will keep you updated as they come out. Thralls, again, Avalanche, not doing great. And that is kind of the Freljord identity that Thralls takes on. And ultimately, yeah, is it good versus Control? Yeah, but it's not very good versus Scouts. It's not great versus Elusive Rally and these other Demacia-based decks. And if we're seeing, like, Elusive Rally, Yordles in arms, and Scouts come out as this week's aggro lineup, then I don't know if Thralls are going to be able to keep up with something like that. But if aggro doesn't perform well this week and we move again more towards the Control style of gameplay, Thralls get to come back in a big way, because Thralls are very good into Control. Yordles in arms, hanging around. Spider aggro and Draven Rumble Burn, they're not down and out. They took a sabbatical week 2, but that doesn't mean that they won't come back as players play control decks that are more oriented towards beating things like Scouts and Elusive Rally and Azir Aurelia and other Demacia-based strategies. Maybe we get to a point where Burn does slip back through the cracks. Not super optimistic for it. I don't think we've ever actually seen Spiders fall out of the meta and then come back. I'm really not expecting it to happen this time, but I think that it's still like a fine choice as we continue to see players really try to bully the Ari Kennen and things of that nature. Landmark, Zillion Zereth. Still figuring it out. You know, I think Gamebreaker just won another fight night with Zillion Zereth, but the 2-deck and 3-deck metas are wildly different, and I'm curious how Zillion Zereth does into Scouts. It didn't do very well into Spiders or Draven Rumble or Pirates, but maybe it does do a little bit better into, if not Scouts, then like Elusive Rally and Yordles in arms, or whatever other aggro decks players are bringing. I could see Zillion Zereth sticking around. I'm not super optimistic for it. I think tier 3 is the perfect place for it, but it is what it is. Anivia, I already talked about, and then Elusive Rally. You're just not as good as Scouts. You're doing a similar thing to Scouts, but you're worse at it than Scouts. And I'm already not big on Scouts, so I'm even more down on Elusive Rally. And it was players that I kind of expected to bring it that brought it. So I'm not sure that it's even going to stick around into week 3 as like the secondary aggro deck. And I think players are just kind of figuring out what aggro is looking like. And they know that Scouts is good, and they're sort of floundering on what else is good. So again, this week, we're kind of still in flux. We're kind of feeling things out. I think that we're going to continue to see Control do very well. Very curious to see what anti-control decks players can come up with. Like 4LW last week had the Zoe Lux deck that was performing very well, because Lux is sort of like this weird pseudo threat where you need to deal with her, even if the opponent doesn't have a good hand to facilitate the Lux, because you have to assume that they do. And with Lux now being able to burn face, she is a certified threat. You can't play around that as much as you used to be able to. So, again, still very touch and go for the most part, but pretty confident in the tier list, gaining confidence as we get closer and closer to the seasonal, and by the seasonal, I will have extreme confidence. But the big question of the weekend is, what do Scouts lineups look like? Have players finally figured out how to actually counter Ari Kennen? Because players are top 8ing tournaments with counter lineups, but they are not winning tournaments with it, and Ari Kennen still is. I don't think that it's at TFIZ level where it's like it is strictly wrong to try and counter this. I think it's a very viable effort, and we're just kind of seeing how it goes still. So I think that's one of those things that we're going to be flip-flopping on up until the actual hour before the seasonal. Can you actually come to counter Ari Kennen? And I think we're just going to see success on both sides of the board because the top 32 is a lot of spots. So, but anyway, that is going to do it for me. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If I were playing this weekend, I have no idea what I would bring. I could tell you what I would bring, but it's like not a cohesive lineup, and you'd just be hearing it for like posterity's sake. You should not be taking advice on what lineup I would bring this weekend because I put negative thought into it. But thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Boulevard, and of course I will have signups to the Mastering Runeterra Qualifier number 6 in the description below, and if I find another tournament that is happening this weekend and is open, then I will be sure to link it as well. So be sure to check back on Saturday morning to see if I was able to update that with anything. But in the meantime, good luck in your tournaments.